Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling Councillor Krespel by E.T.A. Hoffmann, published in the year 1819. The story of a strange old gentleman who builds houses without a plan and takes precious violins apart. And the story of his daughter, who possesses a voice she is not allowed to use. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried into a small German town where people tell of a man whom no one understands. When I came to that town, in which I was to spend a few years of my life, the first thing I was told was the story of Councillor Krespel's house building. And it was told with that pleasure with which small towns speak of their eccentrics. Councillor Krespel was a man in his best years, a trained jurist who stood in the service of a prince and was widely esteemed for his legal opinions. He was well-to-do, he was educated, and he was the most whimsical person the town had ever seen. For one day, he resolved to build himself a house. He bought a garden at the edge of town, had stones and lime and timber brought, ordered masons and carpenters, and then went out to the site himself and began. There was no building plan. He had drawn none and wanted none. When the master mason asked for the measurements, Krespel had him dig a pit, lay a foundation, and raise walls, always only as far as he commanded at the moment. The workmen labored, shaking their heads, but they were well paid and did as they were told. So 4 walls grew up into the air, without a single opening, no window, no door, nothing. When the beams were laid and the roof covered, there stood in the middle of the garden a closed box of stone into which no one could get. The town laughed, but Krespel had a ladder set up, climbed it, clambered in over the top of the wall, and wandered about inside for days, went from corner to corner, stopped, murmured, spread out his arms. Then he called the masons and pointed with his stick at the wall. Here a window, so high, so wide. There a door. Here a smaller opening. And the men broke out what he marked. So the house got its windows and doors, each in the place where Krespel wanted it, because he had felt from within where light and passage must be. When it was finished, he gave the workmen a feast in the garden, and all who had watched and mocked had to admit the house was beautiful. It was unusual, it resembled no other, but whoever entered felt within it a comfort that could not be explained. I made the councillor's acquaintance in person soon after, for I frequented a house that he visited regularly, that of Professor M., where music was made and people sat together in the evenings. Krespel was gladly seen there, though at first I did not grasp why. He entered without properly greeting anyone, sat down wherever it pleased him, and talked without stopping, leaping between subjects and registers like a bird between branches. He would suddenly laugh out loud in the middle of a serious sentence, and in the middle of the laughter he could fall silent and stare darkly before him. As he spoke, he moved incessantly. He sprang up, walked about, turned on a heel, sat down again. Sometimes he drew out a notebook, without anyone asking, and wrote something in it. Whoever saw him for the first time took him for mad. Whoever had seen him 10 times noticed that behind it all, a sharp, cold intellect was at work, the one that had made his legal opinions so famous, and that the leaps were not disorder, but an order one did not know. But his real passion was music, and here the riddle began. Krespel collected violins, not just any, but old, precious instruments of Italian masters, for which he undertook long journeys and paid sums over which the town shook its head. And with each he proceeded in the same way. He brought it home, shut himself in his room with it, and played on it, a single time. He played for hours, and whoever passed by outside stopped, for Krespel was a master of the instrument, and what came through the windows was of a beauty that gripped one by the throat. And when he had finished, he took the violin and took it apart. He loosened the neck, lifted the top off with the greatest care, examined the shavings, the linings, the bass bar, looked into the hollow body like a physician into a chest, held the individual parts against the light, and then laid them with the others. For none was ever put together again. In a cabinet in his room lay the remains of many instruments, tops and backs and ribs neatly ordered, each provided with a label, and Krespel said, when one asked him about it, that it was all a searching. For what, he did not say. There was one violin that he did not touch. It hung on the wall of his room, an old instrument of unremarkable appearance, and when a guest reached for it or even came too near, Krespel could grow violent, as one otherwise never saw him. This violin, he said, was not for taking apart, and not for playing. It would remain as it was. And once, when he was in a good mood, he took it down and played on it, alone in the room, with the door closed. And whoever heard it said it was not like other violin playing, but like a human voice that sings. But I am getting ahead of myself. For in the same house, behind the same willfully placed windows, there lived someone else, of whom the town only whispered. Krespel's daughter, Antonie. One scarcely ever got to see her. She was a delicate, beautiful girl of perhaps 20, and when she once went through the streets at her father's side, he held her arm with a care that verged on the anxious, and talked at her without ceasing, looking in all directions as though danger threatened from everywhere. The two received no visitors, and yet from the councillor's house there sometimes came out something that made passers-by stop. A tone that one took for a woman's voice, bright and pure and of a warmth one could not describe. And whoever told of it was never afterward quite sure whether it had been singing or something else, and with it the violin that accompanied it. And whoever told of it did so softly, as if speaking of something forbidden. For it happened rarely, perhaps once or twice a year, and always only for a short time. And always, when the singing fell silent, Krespel was not seen for days afterward. I asked in the house I frequented what the matter was with this. No one knew. One knew only that Antonie did not sing, that the father had forbidden it strictly and without exception, and that he turned out of the house anyone who asked her for it. A young composer, it was said, had once been in the house for a time and had made music with her, and Krespel had driven him away. The town drew its conclusions from this, as towns do. The old man was jealous of his daughter's art. He locked her up. He begrudged the world her voice. I myself did not think much better of him, until that evening on which I first came into Krespel's house. It came about by chance. I had a letter to deliver for the professor that brooked no delay, and so I stood one autumn evening before the whimsical door of that house and pulled the bell. Krespel opened himself. He looked at me as though he had first to recollect who I was. Then he laughed, took me by the arm and drew me in, and before I could state my errand, I was sitting in his room, had a glass of wine before me, and was listening to him. The room was high and bright, with the willfully placed windows, and on the walls hung instruments, and in a corner stood that cabinet with the dismantled violins. Krespel talked, sprang up, walked about, explained to me the construction of the Italian masters, held tops and backs against the light for me, rapped them with his knuckles so that they rang, and was so lively and so full of knowledge that I forgot my errand. And in the middle of this talking, a door opened, and Antonie entered. I saw her for the first time close up. She was pale, but it was no sickly pallor, rather that fine translucency that some people have. She was of a quiet, grave beauty, and when she noticed me, she bowed in a friendly way. But Krespel was beside her in a leap, talked at her, led her to an armchair, adjusted a cushion for her, asked whether she was cold, whether she was tired, whether she had not better go up again, and all this in that hasty, tumbling tone that with him meant tenderness and startled the stranger. Antonie bore it with a patience that turned my heart over. She looked at her father, and in that look there was not a trace of resentment. We then talked, the three of us, and it was a good conversation. And once, when music came up, Antonie said something about an aria that was so precise and so full of knowledge that I involuntarily said she must be a great singer herself. In the same instant, it grew still in the room. Antonie lowered her gaze, and Krespel stood there, the glass in his hand, and looked at me with a face in which all that was foolish had gone out. Then he said very softly, "My daughter does not sing," and turned away. And I understood that I had touched on something that in this house was not touched. I soon went, confused and ashamed, and I would probably have let the matter rest had Krespel not appeared at my lodging a few days later. He came without announcement, sat down, talked for a while about indifferent things, and then said abruptly that I had hurt him the other day in his room, without meaning to, and that therefore he wished to tell me how the matter stood, so that I should not think as the others in the town did. And then he told, in his leaping way, with long detours and sudden silences, the story of his life. As a young man, he had been in Italy for the violins, and there he had come to know a singer, Angela, celebrated at all the houses, beautiful, capricious, with a voice that tore people from their seats. He had married her, and it had become a marriage such as had to come about between two such people, glowing and unbearable. Angela endured no contradiction and no quiet. Krespel endured no caprices and no stage. They quarreled, made up, quarreled again, and one day, after a performance, he left the house and traveled away, and did not come back. From this marriage came a child, a girl, who stayed with the mother. Years later, the news reached him that Angela had died, and shortly afterward his daughter was brought to him. Antonie was almost grown by then, and with her came the mother's inheritance, the voice. When Krespel heard her sing for the first time, he said it was as if Angela were in the room, and at the same time it was something greater. What the mother had possessed in art, the daughter possessed in soul. He had wept and been happy as never before in his life. And then came the physician. For Antonie had inherited something else from the mother, too, an ailment of the chest, a flaw in the structure, as Krespel called it, with that precision with which he spoke of violins. The physician examined her and told him what had to be told. It was precisely this ailment that gave her voice its incomprehensible sound. The one without the other did not exist, and if she went on singing, she would die, not in years, but soon. From that day on, Krespel said, there had been only one task for him. He took his daughter to live with him in the house with the willful windows, and he forbade her to sing. Not out of hardness, he had implored her, he said. He had gone down on his knees before her. And Antonie had understood and obeyed, and that had been the hardest thing, that she did not contradict, but only grew quiet. For it was clear to him, of course, what he was taking from her. A person in whom that dwells, said Krespel, and who is not allowed to let it out, lives like one whose mouth is held shut, every day, all his life long. Now I understood everything else as well. The anxiety with which he led her through the streets, the harshness toward every visitor who brought music into the house. That young composer whom the town pitied had made music with Antonie and brought her to sing, and Krespel had driven him away like a murderer. and in his eyes he was one. And I understood the violins. He was searching, said Krespel, and now he also said, for what? He was searching in the old instruments for the cause of the sound. He took them apart because he wanted to know why the one sings and the other only tones, where the secret sits, in which shaving, in which curve, and whether one could reproduce it. For if a violin could sing as Antonie did, then Antonie would not need to sing anymore. Then she would have her voice outside her body, where it did her no harm. And then he spoke of that one violin that hung on his wall and that he would never take apart. He had found it years ago, he said, and when he drew the first tone from it, he had started, for it was her voice. Not similar, her voice. Since then, this violin had been the life in his house. When it came over Antonie too strongly, when the silence threatened to crush her, then he sat down and played on it, and Antonie sat by and listened. And then she sang, as it were, herself, and was happy. That, said Krespel, was what the people outside sometimes heard, and of which they could not say afterward what it was. I sat there and was ashamed of every thought I had had about this man. The fool of the town, the violin butcher, the tyrant of his daughter. He sat opposite me and was a father who for years had done nothing but defend his child's life against a single temptation.
I left the town soon after, and what I still have to tell I learned later from letters and on a last visit. It was Krespel himself who told me, and he told it calmly, like one who is finished with everything. On one night, it was a spring, and Antonie had been cheerful all day long, Krespel dreamed, and the dream was of a distinctness such as dreams rarely have. He saw himself sitting in the next room at the piano, and Antonie stood beside him and sang. It was that music which they both loved, and she sang as she had never sung, and in the dream Krespel was not frightened, but happy. And he thought, so it is permitted after all. Now it does no harm anymore. They sang and played the whole night through, and the young composer was there too, and no one spoke of prohibitions. When Krespel awoke, it was morning. He went through the house, and it was still. He found his daughter in her room on the sofa with closed eyes, and her face was calm and wore a smile such as he had not seen for a long time. Antonie was dead. And when, without knowing what he did, he stepped into his own room and looked at the wall, there hung the violin with a cracked top. The crack ran across the wood. It had cracked in the same night in which the other had broken, and no one had touched it. Krespel buried the violin with his daughter. He had it laid in the coffin at her feet, and no one asked him about it, for whoever knew him knew that it was no longer an eccentricity. He grew still afterward. He bought no more violins, he took none apart any more, he searched no more, and the town that had laughed at him so long now passed his house in silence. I last saw him sitting in his garden under the trees, his hands in his lap, and he said to me something that I have kept. He said he had spent his whole life breaking open instruments to find out where in them the tone dwells. He had never found it. It sits in no shaving and in no curve. It sits in this, that a thing is whole, and whoever opens it up to look inside has already lost it. That was our short retelling of Councillor Krespel by E.T.A. Hoffmann. A father takes from his daughter the one thing that keeps her alive in order to save her life, and must learn that some things cannot be divided into what kills us and what we are here for. What we love most cannot be taken apart. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.